In the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, the old farmhouse stood like a sentinel against the endless fields of Lancaster County, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of unspoken sins. The air inside was thick with the scent of baked bread and something sharper, more primal, fear, perhaps, or the rot of secrets buried deep. Naomi Washington, 19 years old but trapped in a body that betrayed her at every turn, lay in her narrow bed upstairs, her twisted limbs a testament to the cruel hand fate had dealt her from birth. Down below, her mother, Sarah, stirred the pot on the wood stove, her hands moving mechanically, eyes darting to the shadows where her husband, Elias, lounged in his rocker, pipe smoke curling like a noose around his weathered face. Their son, Jacob, barely out of boyhood but already hardened by the farm's relentless toil, hovered nearby, his gaze lingering too long on the staircase. For 3 years now, this ritual had played out, a silent conspiracy woven into the fabric of their devout Amish life, where obedience was God and outsiders were the devil. But tonight, as the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, carrying whispers of change, Sarah felt the first crack in her resolve, a tremor that promised the storm to come. In the vast, rolling farmlands of rural Pennsylvania, where buggies clip-clop along unpaved roads and the world beyond feels like a distant rumor, the Washington family lived in a seclusion that bordered on invisibility. Their modest farmhouse, painted plain white with no electricity humming through its wires, no telephone line stretching to the outside, stood as a fortress of Amish tradition. Elias and Sarah Washington had built their life according to the Ordnung, the unwritten rules that governed every aspect of existence, from the width of a hat brim to the rejection of modern conveniences that might tempt pride or worldly attachment. Neighbors, fellow church members in their conservative district, rarely intruded. Family matters were sacred, resolved within the home or, at most, through quiet counsel from the bishops. Naomi, their youngest daughter, entered the world differently from her siblings. Born with profound disabilities, limbs that would never straighten fully, a mind that grasped the world slowly and expressed it even more haltingly, she required care that set her apart in a community where able-bodied labor defined worth from childhood. While her brothers and sisters rose at dawn to milk cows, tend crops, or sew quilts for market, Naomi's days were confined to a simple room upstairs, her twisted form dependent on others for the most basic needs. The family's isolation intensified as her condition became undeniable, a quiet burden that Elias bore with stern resolve and Sarah with weary resignation. Outsiders, the English, as they were called, seldom crossed their threshold. Deliveries came and went without lingering conversation. Church services, held every other Sunday in rotating homes, focused on sermons and shared meals, not personal trials. Whispers might circulate about a child's illness or a harvest's failure, but deeper troubles were buried beneath layers of humility and submission. In this enclosed world, where forgiveness was commanded and questioning authority risked shunning, the hidden dynamics began to fester. Naomi's vulnerability, evident in her helpless cries and trusting eyes, created an imbalance that the family's rigid structure could neither acknowledge nor mend. The farm's endless chores demanded obedience, and the community's watchful distance ensured that what happened behind closed doors remained unseen, unspoken, a shadow lengthening across the years. In the shadowed upstairs room where Naomi spent most of her days, Elias Washington first crossed the invisible line that separated duty from something darker. It began not with violence, but with lingering touches during the routine tasks of tending to her, bathing her fragile body, changing linens soiled by her lack of control, feeding her when her hands trembled too much to hold a spoon. He spoke softly then, his voice a low murmur in Pennsylvania Dutch, framing his actions as necessary care, a father's solemn responsibility in a world that offered no respite for the afflicted. Naomi, with her limited words and trusting gaze, could not protest beyond faint whimpers, her mind trapped in a fog that made comprehension fleeting. Elias justified it to himself as mercy, a way to ease his own burdens in a life of unyielding labor, where weakness was a sin to be endured quietly. Sarah, moving about the kitchen below, caught glimpses through the open door or heard the unusual silences that stretched too long. At first, she dismissed the unease gnawing at her. A wife's duty was submission, after all, and questioning her husband invited the wrath of both man and God. She busied her hands with churning butter or mending clothes, telling herself that Elias was merely thorough in his ministrations, that Naomi's cries were the usual sounds of discomfort from her condition. But as weeks turned to months, the subtleties sharpened. The way Elias lingered upstairs after supper, the locked door on occasions when chores called him elsewhere, the faint bruises blooming on Naomi's pale skin like accusations unspoken. Guilt flickered in Sarah's chest during prayer meetings, where hymns of forgiveness rose in harmony, but she pushed it down, clinging to the ordnung's demand for harmony within the home. To voice suspicion would shatter the fragile peace of their isolated existence, invite scrutiny from the ministers, perhaps even shunning. So she watched from the edges, her eyes averting when Elias descended the stairs with a satisfied flush, rationalizing his growing possessiveness as protective devotion. Naomi's vulnerability, once a shared family cross, became Elias's private domain, exploited in stolen moments under the guise of paternal love, while the farm's rhythms continued unchanged. Cows milked at dawn, fields plowed under relentless sun, the community's distant buggies passing without pause. In this cloistered world, where outward piety masked inner fractures, the manipulations took root, subtle and insidious, binding mother and daughter in a silence that grew heavier with each passing day. In the quiet hours after supper, when the farm's demands eased and the family gathered in the flickering lamplight, Jacob Washington began to shadow his father's footsteps more closely than ever. Barely 16, broad-shouldered from years of plowing and harvesting, he had always been Elias's echo, obedient, watchful, absorbing the unspoken lessons of authority in a household where the man's word was law. At first, it was mere curiosity that drew him upstairs when Elias tended to Naomi, lingering in the hallway with excuses of fetching water or linens. Elias noticed, of course. His eyes, sharp beneath the brim of his hat, met his son's without reproach, a silent acknowledgement passing between them like the sharing of a forbidden tool. Naomi, confined to her bed with her crooked limbs and halting speech, offered no resistance beyond confused murmurs, her world limited to the room's four walls and the faces that loomed over her. Jacob watched as his father extended those moments of care, the door closed firmly against the rest of the house, and something shifted in the boy, a hardening, perhaps, or an awakening to the power imbalance that defined their isolated life. Elias began to invite him in, speaking in low tones about burdens and releases, framing it as a man's prerogative in a world that demanded so much and gave so little solace. Jacob hesitated at first, his hands trembling as he mimicked his father's actions, but the habit took hold quickly, fueled by the secrecy that bound them. Sarah heard the creak of floorboards more frequently now, the muffled sounds that filtered down the stairs blending with the wind rattling the windows. She paused in her scrubbing or sewing, a knot tightening in her stomach, yet she said nothing, turning instead to the familiar rhythms of prayer and work to drown the growing unease. Jacob's involvement marked the true escalation, transforming solitary acts into a shared ritual, father and son descending the stairs with flushed faces and averted eyes, the air between them thick with complicity. Naomi's whimpers grew fainter over time, her body bearing new marks that Sarah dressed in silence, rationalizing it all as the cross they bore in their plain, devout existence. The community's buggies passed on Sundays, oblivious to the deepening shadows within the farmhouse, where obedience twisted into something far darker, the pattern of torment solidifying into a grim routine that no outsider would question. In the confines of her upstairs room, where sunlight filtered weakly through plain curtains, Naomi Washington tried in her own limited way to convey the pain that had become her daily reality. Her speech, halting and slurred from birth, emerged as garbled pleas or sharp cries during the nights when Elias or Jacob visited her bed, their heavy footsteps on the stairs a harbinger she had come to dread. She would reach out with twisted hands, pushing weakly at their forms, or turn her face to the wall, tears streaming as she uttered fragmented words, "No, hurt, ma'am," appealing to the mother who sometimes lingered just beyond the door. But those sounds, muffled by thick walls and the ever-present wind across the fields, rarely carried far enough to pierce the veil of the family's isolation. Downstairs, Sarah heard them more often than she admitted, pausing mid-chore with a sharp intake of breath, only to resume scrubbing or stirring as if nothing had changed. To speak of it would invite chaos into their ordered world, where the bishops preached forgiveness and non-resistance, and family troubles were confessed privately before the church, not aired to the English authorities who might shatter their way of life. Naomi's attempts at resistance, scratching feebly, crying out louder in moments of clarity, were met with stern rebukes from Elias, who framed them as childish defiance, or gentle hushing from Jacob, who had learned his father's ways all too well. During rare visits from neighbors or extended family, Naomi's distress manifested in withdrawn silence or sudden outbursts that the community attributed to her affliction, a trial from God to be borne with patience. Whispers might pass among the women after church, concern for the girl's worsening health, her thinning frame, but the traditions of non-interference held firm. Prying into another's home risked accusation of pride or gossip, sins as grave as any other. Ministers offered prayers for strength during Sunday services, held in rotating barns where hymns drowned out deeper questions, and no one pressed Sarah for explanations when Naomi was kept upstairs, too unwell to join the fellowship meal. In this tightly bound enclave, where obedience to father and church superseded all, Naomi's fragmented communications faded into the background noise of farm life, cows lowing at dawn, buggies rumbling past without stopping. Her suffering, expressed in the only ways her body allowed, went unheeded beyond vague sympathies, dismissed as the unfortunate lot of the disabled in a community that valued stoic endurance above confrontation. The weight of unspoken rules ensured that her pleas, faint echoes in the night, dissolved into silence, ignored by those who might have listened but chose the path of least disruption. In the quiet rhythms of the Washington farmhouse, where mornings began with the scrape of chairs and the murmur of prayers in Pennsylvania Dutch, Sarah Washington wrestled with a torment that gnawed deeper than any physical labor. She had borne Naomi in pain, knowing from the first cries that her daughter would never walk the fields or join the women in quilting bees, her body twisted by a condition the community accepted as God's will, to be endured without complaint or cure from the English doctors. Loyalty to Elias was etched into her soul, the vows taken before the church, the submission preached from pulpits in barn gatherings, where wives were to honor husbands as heads of the home. And Jacob, her strong son, the one who would inherit the land, carry the family name, to question him felt like unraveling the very threads of their existence. Yet the sounds from upstairs pierced her like thorns, Naomi's muffled whimpers during the long evenings when Elias or Jacob lingered too long in her room, the creak of the bed frame that carried through the thin floors. Sarah would freeze at the stove, hands buried in dough, heart pounding as fleeting images assaulted her, Naomi's trusting eyes, wide with confusion and hurt, the bruises she dressed in silence, blaming falls or clumsiness. Guilt surged in waves during family devotions, when Elias read from the Bible about love and obedience, his voice steady while her own prayers choked in her throat. Moments of clarity struck like lightning, a desperate urge to burst through the door, to shield her child, to flee into the night with Naomi cradled in her arms, but fear quenched them swiftly. What would the ministers say? Shunning loomed, the ultimate exile from family, church, the only world she knew. Instead, she clung to rationalizations whispered in the dark. This was a trial sent to test their faith. Elias's burdens as provider justified his releases, Jacob merely following his father's lead in a house where men ruled unchecked. Fleeting tenderness toward Naomi, brushing her hair, spooning broth into her mouth, brought stabs of remorse, quickly buried beneath chores and hymns. The community's distant gaze reinforced her silence. No one pried into marital matters, and to confess would brand her faithless, invite judgment upon them all. So the internal war raged, loyalty clashing against maternal instinct in stolen glances at the staircase, guilt flickering like the lamp's flame during sleepless nights, as the years accumulated in a haze of unspoken agony, binding her tighter to the shadows that enveloped their plain, isolated home in the midst of a particularly harsh Pennsylvania winter, when snow blanketed the fields and the farm's isolation felt absolute. A rare visitor arrived at the Washington doorstep, an English supplier, delivering feed and supplies that the community occasionally relied upon despite their rejection of modern conveniences. The man, accustomed to brief transactions at the barn door, was invited inside by Elias for a hot coffee to ward off the chill, a gesture of plain hospitality that masked the family's guarded world. Sarah bustled about the kitchen, her movements precise and unhurried, while Jacob lingered nearby, his eyes flicking toward the staircase with habitual caution. Naomi, confined upstairs as always, let out a faint cry during the visit, a sound that carried faintly down the wooden steps, sharper than usual in the quiet house. The supplier paused, his brow furrowing at the unexpected noise, inquiring politely if everything was all right, if perhaps the child needed assistance. Elias waved it off smoothly, explaining Naomi's condition with practiced words, a burden from God, prone to fits and discomforts that no doctor could mend, best handled within the family as the ordnung demanded. Sarah nodded along, her hands steady as she poured the coffee, though her gaze darted briefly upward, a flicker of something unspoken crossing her features before she averted her eyes to the stove. The man pressed gently, his outsider's perspective unaccustomed to the walls of silence that bound Amish homes, suggesting perhaps a visit from a specialist or aid from county services, offers born of genuine concern in a world where such vulnerabilities were met with intervention. Cultural barriers rose like invisible fences, the deep-seated mistrust of English ways, the fear that inviting scrutiny might lead to interference, loss of autonomy, or worse, shunning for breaching the community's code of self-reliance. Elias's tone grew firmer, polite yet unyielding, steering the conversation back to the weather and the harvest, while Jacob stood silent, his presence a subtle reinforcement of the family's united front. The supplier left soon after, his suspicions stirred but unspoken, the vast distance between Amish plainness and the modern world preventing any follow-through, any call to authorities that might have pierced the veil. In the farmhouse, the moment passed like a brief gust of wind, the routine resuming with supper preparations and evening prayers, Naomi's needs attended in the shadows upstairs, the faint spark of outside notice extinguished by traditions that prized privacy above all, allowing the hidden torment to persist unchecked amid the endless cycle of chores and devotion as the seasons turned in the quiet expanse of Lancaster County's farmlands. Naomi Washington's frail body began to bear the unmistakable marks of prolonged suffering, cheeks hollowed from meager appetite, eyes dulled by a pain that no simple affliction could explain, limbs more contorted than her condition alone warranted. Her cries, once sharp in the night, had softened to whimpers that barely disturbed the heavy silence of the house, her spirit worn thin by the relentless visits from Elias and Jacob, who ascended the stairs with increasing boldness, their absences from evening chores explained away with vague mutterings about tending to her needs. Sarah noticed the changes most acutely during her daily rituals of care bathing Naomi's thinning frame, noting the fresh shadows under her eyes, the way she flinched at the slightest touch, her fragmented words trailing off into silence when questioned gently in the Pennsylvania Dutch they shared. Yet on Sundays, when the community gathered for worship in neighboring barns or homes, the family's facade held firm. Naomi was kept secluded upstairs, deemed too frail for the long buggy ride or the bustle of fellowship, her absence attributed to recurring ailments that drew sympathetic nods and offers of herbal remedies from the womenfolk. Sarah dressed in her finest cape and apron, sitting beside Elias on the hard benches as hymns filled the air, her voice joining the harmony while her mind wandered to the room above the fields. Elias and Jacob presented as dutiful providers, their broad hands calloused from honest work, engaging in talk of crops and weather, the picture of plain piety that no one thought to question. During shared meals after services, tables laden with roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and pies, the Washingtons blended seamlessly, passing dishes with polite smiles, Naomi's empty place unspoken, her deterioration hidden behind closed doors and careful excuses. Neighbors remarked on her long-standing disabilities, offering prayers for endurance rather than probing deeper, bound by the unspoken code that family trials were private burdens, not communal concerns. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she served, glimpses of Naomi's wasting form flashing in her thoughts, the weight loss that no amount of broth could reverse, the listless gaze that once held sparks of recognition. The concealment became second nature, bruises covered by long sleeves, weakness blamed on fevers that came and went, the truth buried beneath layers of devotion and denial as gatherings dispersed with buggies rumbling away, leaving the farmhouse to its shadows once more. The years of torment etched deeper into Naomi's being, her physical and emotional unraveling a silent testament witnessed only within those walls, while the outer world saw only the stoic facade of a family upholding their faith amid hardship. In the dim confines of the Washington farmhouse, where the rhythms of prayer and labor once offered Sarah a fragile sense of order, her passive glances upward during evening chores evolved into a deliberate quiet complicity that anchored the family's unraveling secret. She had long since ceased pausing at the muffled sounds drifting from Naomi's room, the creak of footsteps, the faint protests that grew weaker with time, convincing herself that intervention would invite divine judgment or communal exile. Elias spoke of it rarely, framing his and Jacob's actions as a necessary outlet in their austere life, a private matter sanctified by his authority as head of the household, and Sarah nodded in silence, her hands kneading bread or folding laundry as if agreement could absolve her. To preserve the family's standing among their conservative Amish neighbors, where whispers of discord could lead to scrutiny from the ministers or outright shunning, Sarah wove a tapestry of justifications drawn from the Ordnung's emphasis on forgiveness and submission. Naomi's worsening condition, the weight loss, the vacant stares, the unexplained marks were attributed to her disabilities, a cross God had laid upon them, best endured without drawing English eyes or church intervention. During Sunday gatherings, Sarah sat primly in her cape dress, exchanging pleasantries about quilts and harvests, her smile a mask that deflected any probing concern about the daughter kept hidden away. Jacob, now fully initiated into the ritual, descended the stairs with the same flushed detachment as his father, and Sarah met his gaze without reproach, rationalizing his participation as obedience to Elias, a son's duty in a world where questioning the patriarch risked eternal consequences. Guilt lingered in fleeting moments while brushing Naomi's hair or spooning thin soup into her mouth, but Sarah buried it beneath hymns sung in harmony, reminding herself that outward harmony preserved their place in the community, their plain life untainted by scandal. The abuse, stretched across 3 relentless years, became normalized in her mind, a shadowed corner of their devotion where loyalty to husband and son outweighed the silent pleas of a vulnerable daughter. The farmhouse walls holding fast to the illusion of piety as buggies passed obliviously on the dirt roads outside on a crisp autumn evening, as the Washington farmhouse settled into its familiar quiet after supper, a sharp cry from Naomi's upstairs room cut through the walls more piercingly than usual, carrying on the wind to the neighboring property where an elderly Amish couple sat on their porch mending harnesses. The sound was not the typical muffled whimper that might blend with the lowing of cattle or the rustle of leaves, but a raw, desperate wail laced with words, fragmented pleas in Pennsylvania Dutch that hinted at terror rather than mere discomfort from her disabilities. The neighbor, a widower known for his keen ears from years of listening for distant buggies, paused in his work, tilting his head toward the source, his wife exchanging a troubled glance as the cry repeated, followed by hurried footsteps and a door slamming shut. In the tight-knit community where homes dotted the landscape at respectful distances and privacy was upheld as a virtue next to godliness, such sounds rarely escaped notice entirely, especially on still nights when windows were cracked open against the lingering warmth of the day. Whispers began almost immediately, carried during the next day's errands or shared in hushed tones after church services, the Washington place, something amiss with the girl upstairs, cries that didn't sound like her usual spells. Sarah felt the shift acutely when a sister from the district stopped by with a basket of apples, her questions veiled in concern for Naomi's health but probing deeper, eyes lingering on the staircase as if expecting revelation. Elias dismissed the inquiries with stern assurances of family matters handled in prayer, Jacob avoiding gatherings altogether for a time, but the murmurs persisted among the women quilting or the men at barn raisings, speculation threading through conversations like smoke. Traditions of non-interference held most back from direct confrontation, yet the overheard incident planted seeds of doubt, eroding the facade of plain normalcy that had shielded the household for so long. Sarah's hands shook as she prepared meals, rationalizations faltering under the weight of knowing eyes, the isolation cracking as neighbors weighed loyalty to the Ordnung against an unspoken duty to the vulnerable. The cries, fleeting yet unforgettable, rippled outward in quiet conversations, building a subtle pressure that threatened to summon ministers or even English authorities, the secret teetering on exposure after 3 years of shadowed endurance amid the unchanging fields in the waning months of the 3rd year, as frost etched patterns on the farmhouse windows and the fields lay barren under a gray Pennsylvania sky, the fragile veil of silence that had shrouded the Washington home began to tear. Irreparably. Whispers from that fateful autumn evening, when Naomi's desperate cries pierced the night and reached neighboring ears, had fermented into something more tangible, persistent questions during market days, sidelong glances at church gatherings, and finally, a concerned neighbor's reluctant decision to alert an English social worker who occasionally assisted Amish families with medical needs. Evidence, long concealed in Naomi's deteriorating body, the unexplained weight loss, the recurring infections, the faint scars hidden beneath modest nightgowns, could no longer be dismissed as mere consequences of her disabilities. Sarah sensed the encroaching storm in the tightened lips of women during quilting circles, the ministers probing sermons on truth and repentance that seemed aimed directly at their pew. Elias grew curt, forbidding visitors, and quick to anger, while Jacob retreated into sullen work, avoiding the community's gatherings altogether. Naomi, now a shadow of the girl she had been, lay listless in her room, her body betraying secrets in ways that herbal remedies and prayers could not mend, a swelling abdomen that Sarah noticed with dawning horror during one rare moment of intimate care, a confirmation of the unimaginable that shattered her final rationalizations. When authorities arrived, summoned by mounting reports from outsiders who had pieced together the whispers and Naomi's visible decline, the farmhouse's isolation crumbled. Plainclothes detectives, guided by a bishop's uneasy cooperation, entered the dim rooms where kerosene lamps still flickered, uncovering medical records from a clandestine visit, testimonies coerced from trembling neighbors, and finally Naomi's own fragmented accounts, haltingly conveyed through a trusted aide. The accumulation of 3 years' buried torment spilled forth in examinations that revealed repeated trauma, pregnancies terminated in secrecy or lost to the body's frailty, the mother's passive witness etched in omitted details and averted eyes. Elias and Jacob faced handcuffs amid the stunned gazes of buggies lined along the road, Sarah's world fracturing as loyalty gave way to interrogation, the dark truth of their devout facade exposed to a world that had long looked away, forcing the community to confront the rot beneath its plain exterior as legal proceedings loomed like an unforgiving harvest.